5:44 in the afternoon, the 4th of July, 2026. A boat eases back against a dock in Jackson County, Mississippi, and one by one, the friends step off onto solid ground. They are sunburned, they are tired, they are counting themselves back in from a long day on the water. But there is an empty seat. The young man who rowed out to Horn Island that morning, 18 years old, a college wide receiver, due back for football training in just 2 days, is not among them. His name is Nolan Xavier Wells, and by midnight, his mother will be on the phone with the sheriff's office, asking a question that weeks later still has no answer. 2 days after that boat came back without him, his body is found in the water off the northwestern tip of the island. Then comes the first autopsy, then a second, and the two of them cannot agree on how he died. Now the state's report is finished, but it is sealed. It will not go to the public. It will go to a grand jury. And a room full of strangers, not a coroner, will decide what really happened on Horn Island. So what happened in the hours between that morning launch and that empty seat? Why did he stay behind? And why, when they finally found him, did he have no phone and no keys? Stay with me, because almost nothing about this case is what it first appears to be. Welcome to North American Crime Case. In today's case, the death of Nolan Xavier Wells on Horn Island. Before we get into it, do us one favor. Subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We read them. Now, let us get into it. Before Horn Island. Before the search boats and the sealed reports and the questions that a whole country would eventually be arguing about, there was just a young man from a small city on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And to understand what was lost out on that water, you first have to understand who was standing on the shore before any of it began. His name was Nolan Xavier Wells. He came from Ocean Springs, Mississippi. If you have never been, picture a place shaped by the water on every side of it. A coastal town where the Gulf is never far from your mind, where the summers are long and heavy and slow, and where, come autumn, a great deal of the town's heartbeat moves to a football field on a Friday night. In towns like this one, high school football is not simply a sport. It is a calendar. It is a language. It is the way a community learns the names of its young men, the way it decides who to be proud of, the way it gathers. And in the fall of 2024, one of the names that community knew was Nolan's. He was a senior that season at Ocean Springs High School. Picture him in the uniform, the pads that make a lean young man look broader than he is, the helmet under one arm, the number on his chest that the people in those stands would come to look for. He was a wide receiver. That is a position built for a certain kind of athlete. Someone fast, someone with soft and certain hands, someone willing to run full speed into open space trusting that the ball will find him. It is a position that asks for courage and precision at the same time. It is not a position for the timid. By every account of the people who knew him, Nolan was not timid. He was tall. He stood out. In a crowd, on a field, in a photograph, he was often the one your eye went to first. He was, in the plainest words his family and their supporters would later use, a good kid. Beloved, the kind of young man about whom people say, without hesitation, that he had everything going for him. And in that final year of high school, everything going for him was not a figure of speech, it was a runway. A senior wide receiver with size and speed on the Mississippi coast is a young man with a future being written in real time, one Friday night at a time. That future had a next chapter already waiting for him, because Nolan's football did not end when high school did. He earned his way to the next level. He became a student and a wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College, a step up, a proving ground, the place where a promising high school athlete finds out whether the promise travels. Community college football in the South is its own hard and hopeful world. It is early mornings and brutal summer conditioning and air you can practically drink. It is film study and playbooks, and the constant grinding competition of young men all chasing the same thing. A spot, a season, and beyond that, the dream that a bigger program is watching. It is not glamorous. It is work, and Nolan had signed up for that work. So the summer of 2026 was not an ending for him. It was a countdown. The season was coming. Training camp was coming. There was a date on the calendar when he was due back, a Monday, right after the holiday weekend, when he would report and begin again, the conditioning and the drills and the long climb toward the fall. Everything about that summer was pointed forward. He was an 18-year-old college athlete with a season in front of him and, as far as anyone around him understood, all the time in the world to grow into the player and the man he was becoming. That is the thing that makes this story so hard to sit with. Nolan was not at an ending, he was at a beginning, and beginnings are not supposed to stop the way his did. Behind him, in every stage of that climb, were the two people who had put him on it. His mother is Christine Wells Wansley. His father is Elmore Wansley. These are not, in this story, background figures. In the weeks that would follow, they would become two of the most visible parents in the country, not because they sought it, but because circumstance forced them onto stages and in front of cameras they never asked to stand before. But long before any of that, they were simply the parents of an athlete. They were the ones in the stands on those Friday nights. They were the ones who raised the tall, fast, well-loved young man that a whole town had watched grow up. Whatever Nolan was becoming, he was becoming it because two people had built the ground beneath him.
Many questions that need to be answered. And is there anything you'd like people to know about Nolan? What would you like them to know about your son?
No,
It's okay.
Nolan, take your time. Nolan was very loving. He was liked by all. It was not a friend that he couldn't make.
No, we'll be right back with more for the parents of Nolan Wells and attorney Ben Crump. We're back now on GMA with the parents of Nolan Wells, Christine and Elmore Wansley. And I want you to please continue to tell us what you want the world to know about your son.
So Nolan was just like this bright light, right? Walk into a room, his smile, his energy was just so infectious. Like it's almost like he drew you into him. And he was just one of those people, like he always wanted everyone to be included. He didn't want anyone to feel left out. I remember one of his teachers emailing us. I can't remember what grade he was in, but basically it was math class. They had a special needs student, and she asked a question, and Nolan got everyone to put their hands down because he wanted that student to answer. And so student answers the question, and she was like, Christine, the classroom, Nolan went crazy, and everyone else started going crazy, just celebrating that child, making them feel included. And that was the person he was. Like he loved everyone. And I always told Nolan, like, you have to be careful when you have such a big heart like that. I love that God blessed you with that, but you have to be careful with that because that it's not always returned, that type of love. But he was just genuinely a good person. Like I always say, all the best parts of me are with him.
And Dad, anything else you want to add?
It's just, he's going to be really missed. I know a lot of his teammates, they all looked at him as a leader. He's more like a silent leader. Not real big on words, more action, which is kind of like I was. I really wasn't real big on talking. I really wanted to show you, and you follow me, and people followed him, and it's gravitated. He put in the work, he worked hard, and he knew he was focused on what he wanted, and he wanted to make life better for his family. He wanted to have his own family. He used to say, Dad, I want to do this, I want to do this, I want to break this. I said, well, son, you got to take it one step at a time. Slow down, let's walk this thing out. Let's train, let's sign our deals, let's make these teams, make these camps, put the work in, and everything else will work out. Even his baby brother, their bond got even stronger because now I have a big brother that he's finna do something, so now I want to outdo that. So his focus and his confidence has got even better. So I was looking forward to both of them having outstanding years.
Seasons,
It seemed like he inspired in the home and he inspired outside of the home.
And that is worth pausing on. Because in a case like this one, a case that would fill the news, a case that strangers online would dissect and argue over, and in some ugly moments exploit, it becomes dangerously easy to forget that at the center of it is not a headline. It is a son. He belonged to a mother and a father. He belonged to teammates who ran the same drills beside him. He belonged to a town that knew his number. Even in her grief, his mother would later say something that tells you everything about the young man they raised and the family that raised him, that she did not want the people who loved him sitting around crying, because that was not what Nolan would have wanted. That is not the statement of a family broken into silence. That is the statement of a family that knew exactly who they had lost and refused to let his memory be only sorrow. Hold on to that, because the further this story goes, the louder the noise around it will become. The experts, the officials, the lawyers, the arguments. And underneath all of it, all the way down, is this simple, ordinary, devastating truth. A young man who was good at a hard sport, loved by the people closest to him, and pointed toward a future he had earned, woke up one morning like any other, with a whole life still ahead of him. That morning was the 4th of July, 2026. It began the way 1,000 summer mornings on the Gulf Coast begin. A holiday, a day off from the countdown to camp, a plan to get out on the water with friends, and let a young man be a young man for one bright afternoon, before the season swallowed him whole. There was nothing about that morning to mark it as different. No warning. No shadow across it, just heat and light and a boat and the open Gulf, and a group of friends heading out toward a barrier island, the way people from that coast have done for generations. Nolan Xavier Wells left that morning as exactly who he had always been. The senior in the uniform, the college receiver with a season waiting, the tall, well-loved son of Christine and Elmore, 18 years old and entirely alive, with every reason to believe he would be back by dark. He would not be. But to understand why, to understand what happened on that island, and why, weeks later, no one could yet agree on the answer, we have to follow him out onto the water. That is where we go next, 10 miles. That is the distance between the Mississippi mainland and Horn Island, roughly 10 miles of open Gulf water, south of Ocean Springs, between the world Nolan Wells knew and the place where he was last seen alive. It is worth taking a moment to understand what kind of place Horn Island actually is, because everything that follows happens on its terms. Horn Island is a barrier island, a long, low ribbon of sand and dune and pine sitting out in the Gulf of Mexico, part of a protected national seashore. It is beautiful. People from the coast will tell you it is one of the most beautiful places in the state, but its beauty is the wild kind. There are no shelters on Horn Island. There are no facilities. There is no reliable communication. No stores, no lifeguards, no lights when the sun goes down. When you are on Horn Island, you are on your own, in a way that is easy to forget on a bright holiday afternoon, and impossible to forget after dark. The only way on is by boat, and the only way off is the boat you came on. On the morning of the 4th of July, 2026, that is where Nolan Wells was headed. He went the way thousands of Gulf Coast residents go every Independence Day, by boat, with friends, out to the island for a day of sun and water and celebration. Horn Island on the 4th of July is a gathering place. Boats anchor along its shores. Music carries over the water. It is, for most of the people who make that trip, one of the best days of the summer. Nolan made the trip with a group of his high school friends. And there is one detail about that group which, in the weeks to come, the entire country would fixate on. In the photographs taken on that boat, photographs that would later be studied by millions of strangers, Nolan stands tall at the center, his arms slung easily around the shoulders of his friends, smiling, and he appears to be the only black young man in the group. On the morning of July 4th, that detail meant nothing more than the simple fact of it. These were his friends, the people he had grown up alongside, and this was a holiday. What that detail would come to mean to the wider world, and why, is a matter we will come to in its proper place. For now, hold the image as it was taken, a group of young people, and a smiling 18-year-old at the center of the frame, heading out across 10 miles of water. What happened on that island, over the hours that followed, is the heart of this entire case. And here is the honest truth about it. Much of it is still not publicly known. Here is what has been reported. At some point during that day on Horn Island, the group's time together came to an end, and Nolan did not leave with them. According to one of the friends, Nolan chose to stay behind on the island, and the reason given was simple and almost painfully ordinary. He stayed to talk to a girl. A holiday afternoon, an island full of people, a young man deciding to linger a little longer. If that account is accurate, it is the kind of decision 18-year-olds make every single summer without consequence. But that account has not gone unchallenged. Others have cast doubt on it. And that doubt is not idle internet chatter. It goes to the central question of the case. Because if Nolan stayed willingly, that is one story. And if something else happened in those final hours, if the parting was not as simple as described, that is a very different story. As of this recording, no one outside that island knows with certainty which story is true. And there is a thread running through the official investigation that tells you the investigators themselves are not treating the question as settled. In their public appeals, Jackson County authorities asked for something very specific. They asked anyone who was on or near Horn Island that day to come forward with their original, unedited photographs and videos, and they used a phrase that should stop you cold. They asked particularly for images depicting alleged altercations. Alleged altercations. Those are the investigators' own words, in their own public request. Now be careful here, because precision matters. The sheriff's office has not confirmed that a fight took place on that island. No one has been accused of anything. An alleged altercation is exactly that, alleged. But investigators do not ask the public for footage of altercations unless someone, somewhere, has told them there may be footage of altercations to find. Whatever was said in those interview rooms, whatever accounts reached those investigators, it was enough for them to put that word, altercations, into a public appeal. And they wanted the originals, unedited, metadata intact. The kind of request you make when you want evidence that cannot have been trimmed, cropped, or cleaned up. So hold those two threads side by side, because they do not yet resolve. One account says Nolan stayed behind of his own accord, for the most innocent reason in the world. And the investigators' own public request suggests they were, at minimum, running down reports of something more troubled on that island. Both threads are real, neither is proven. That is where the case genuinely stands. What is documented, precisely documented, is the timeline of the return. At 5:44 in the afternoon, according to Department of Marine Resources records, the boat that had carried Nolan out to Horn Island arrived back at the mainland. This is the moment we opened this story with. The friends were back. Nolan was not with them. And there is one more reported detail about that return trip that investigators would later pore over. At some point that day, a distressed call was made to a local towing company, one of the friends, reporting that the boat was in trouble on the water. Sinking was the word reported. A boat that had gone out full that morning, coming back with an empty seat, and somewhere in between, a call for help about the vessel itself. Investigators have been examining the audio of that call. What it means, whether it is a mundane detail of a bad day on the water or something more significant to the timeline, has not been publicly established. But it is part of the record of that return, and it is one more question layered onto an afternoon already full of them. If a verified public version of that audio exists, you would hear it here, attributed plainly as evidence under examination. Where it cannot be verified, we will not play it. In a case like this, we deal only in what can be shown. Then came the hours that every parent fears. Evening fell. On the mainland, the holiday wound down. And out on Horn Island, no shelters, no lights, no communication. Night came in over the dunes. Nolan did not call. Nolan did not come home. At around 11 o'clock that night, one of the friends who had been on the trip made a call to the United States Coast Guard, reporting Nolan missing. Think about the weight of that call. A teenager, on the night of the 4th of July, calling the Coast Guard about a friend left across 10 miles of dark water. And near midnight, as July 4th turned into July 5th, a second call was made. This one came from Christine Wells Wansley, Nolan's mother, to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. A mother, in the first hours of what would become the defining ordeal of her life, officially reporting her son missing. 2 calls, inside roughly an hour of each other. A friend calling the Coast Guard, a mother calling the sheriff, and an 18-year-old somewhere out on a wild barrier island in the dark. And threaded through it all, 2 small, stubborn facts that his parents would raise again and again in the weeks ahead. Details that refused to sit comfortably inside any easy explanation. When Nolan was eventually found, he did not have his phone with him, and he did not have his keys. An 18-year-old in the year 2026 separated from his phone, staying behind on an island, by choice, without the 2 things a young man carries everywhere. Maybe there is an innocent explanation, maybe there is not. His own mother and father have asked the question publicly, why? No one has answered it. By the first light of July 5th, the calls had been made, the reports were in, and the machinery of a search was beginning to turn toward Horn Island. what that search found, and when, and where, is where this story goes next. The morning of July 5th, 2026, broke over the Mississippi Gulf Coast the way the morning after a holiday always does. Quiet, hungover with heat, the water scattered with the memory of the day before. But for one family in Ocean Springs, and for a growing number of people in uniform, that morning was not an aftermath. It was a starting gun. Somewhere out across 10 miles of water, on a wild barrier island with no shelter, no lights, and no way to call for help, an 18-year-old had spent the night alone. That was the hope, at least. That was the version of events everyone was still working from, that Nolan Wells was out there, on Horn Island, waiting for daylight and a boat. And so the search began. One of the first pieces of machinery to turn was the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the state agency whose officers patrol these waters. On July 5th, as searchers prepared to scan the island, the Marine Patrol circulated a description of the young man they were looking for. It was, in its way, a heartbreaking document, the kind of plain, administrative email that reduces a whole person to the facts a stranger would need to recognize him. His name, his age, his physical description, height, build, what he might be wearing, the details a searcher on a shoreline would hold in mind while walking the dunes. Think about what that email represents. 24 hours earlier, Nolan Wells was a college athlete on a boat with his friends. His whole summer pointed toward a football season. Now his description was moving through official channels, attached to the word missing. And the search that description launched was not a small one. Over the hours and days that followed, Horn Island, this remote strip of sand and pine that most of the country had never heard of, became the center of one of the most intensive search operations the Mississippi coast had seen. Consider who was out there. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department put multiple vessels on the water. The Mississippi Department of Marine Resources had its own boats working the island. The National Park Service, because Horn Island sits within protected national seashore, had agents on the ground. Biloxi Fire Service personnel joined the effort. A Civil Air Patrol plane traced the island from above. A Jackson County helicopter swept the shoreline. Local, state, and federal, layer upon layer of official machinery, all converging on one island for one missing teenager. The searchers worked the island methodically. Marine Patrol records describe officers covering the southwestern shoreline and its dunes, walking that ground to rule out the possibility that Nolan had ended up there overnight, and then turning their attention to the waters around the island's northwestern tip. Shoreline by shoreline, section by section, they were shrinking the map of places he could be. But here is the detail of this search that tells you what kind of story this really is. The detail that no official report can fully capture. The officials were not alone out there. Alongside the government vessels, private boats dotted the water around Horn Island. Ordinary citizens, people from Ocean Springs, people who knew Nolan or knew his family or simply knew that a local boy was missing, got in their own boats and went. And among them, out on that water, searching that island with their own eyes, were the two people for whom every minute of this search was agony. Christine Wells Wansley and Elmore Wansley, Nolan's mother and father, went to Horn Island themselves. They did not wait by the phone. They did not sit at home while strangers looked for their son. According to Marine Patrol records, as officers approached the island, people on another boat called over to them, and those people were Nolan's parents, together with his former high school football coach. The coach explained to the officers that they, along with other private citizens, had already been on the island searching. The officers gave the coach their phone number so that the family's search and the official search could stay in contact as they worked. Sit with that image for a moment. A mother and a father on a boat off a barrier island, scanning the same dunes as the Marine Patrol, and beside them, the coach, the man who had watched Nolan grow up on a football field, now walking an island looking for him. In small coastal towns, a coach is often something closer to family. When Nolan went missing, his coach did not send a message of support. He got on a boat. It should be said plainly. A search like this one is not a simple thing to run. Multiple agencies means multiple chains of command. County, state, federal, each with its own jurisdiction, its own protocols, its own radio channels. And by the family's own account, the early hours involved some back and forth between the different agencies over exactly that question of jurisdiction. Whose waters, whose island, whose case. None of that is unusual when local, state, and federal authorities converge on the same emergency. But for a family measuring time in heartbeats, Every hour spent sorting out who was in charge was an hour their son was still out there. It is one of the quiet, grinding cruelties of cases like this one, that the machinery built to find the missing takes time to mesh its gears, and the people who love the missing are the ones who feel every second of it. Through July 5th, the search pressed on. The plane overhead, the helicopter along the beaches, the boats working the shallows, the volunteers walking the sand. And through all of it, no sign of Nolan. An island roughly a dozen miles long, and somewhere on it, or near it, the answer everyone was praying would still be a rescue. The night of July 5th fell, a second night, for those keeping the terrible arithmetic that families in these situations cannot stop keeping. A second night of dark water and darker waiting.
Been a week since Nolan Wells' body was found on Horn Island. As the country sits and waits for the investigations to conclude, many questions are still left to be answered. Today I spoke with Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter on where the investigation stands. Speculation continues as to what happened to 18-year-old Nolan Wells over Independence Day weekend. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter met with WLOX to give what updates he could. However, considering
this investigation is active, it's ongoing,
he wasn't able to confirm much. Ledbetter did confirm that interviews have been conducted with witnesses and the department has been in contact with other departments and agencies, including the FBI. The investigation has benefited from information brought by the community.
This recent week we've got a lot of valuable information that has come from the public. We put out a call to action last week for that information, and it has been very productive for us.
Many are preparing for the return of Wells' autopsy. However, toxicology testing is conducted by outside laboratories, and the analysis and review process can take several weeks. A spokesperson for the Mississippi Department of Public Safety states every case is unique and deserves a thorough review. Therefore, cases cannot all be handled the same way or in the same timeline. While theories circle social media, those who are close to Nolan are still waiting for closure, as one friend spoke in an ABC interview.
I think everybody needs to let the investigation continue and let the facts be shown. And if the fact shows that somebody harmed Nolan, I hope that there is justice brought. And if it was a tragic accident and somebody didn't speak up, I still hope justice is brought. The facts is the only thing that's going to overturn that. So that's what I'm just waiting patiently to see before I think anything else. I just know I've lost my best friend.
Then came the morning of July 6th. The searchers went back out. The grid tightened, and it was not, in the end, a sheriff's deputy or a Marine Patrol officer who found what everyone had been dreading. It was a National Park Service agent, a ranger, one of the federal officers whose job is to watch over that protected island. In the water, just off the northwestern shoreline of Horn Island, the same area the Marine Patrol had turned its attention toward, the ranger found him, Nolan Xavier Wells, 18 years old. 2 days after he had smiled at the center of those holiday photographs, his body was recovered from the Gulf waters at the edge of the island he had never left. The search was over. The multi-agency operation that had filled the sky and the water around Horn Island stood down. The Coast Guard call, the midnight report, the description moving through official emails, the parents on the boat, the coach on the dunes, all of it had been racing toward a rescue. And on the morning of July 6th, it became something else instead. It became a death investigation. For the family, the worst answer had arrived. But here is the thing about this case, the thing that separates it from so many tragedies on the water, and the reason you are watching this video at all. The discovery of Nolan's body did not close a single question. It opened all of them. Because now the questions were no longer about where he was. They were about what had happened to him. Why was he in the water? How did he come to be there? What did those final hours on that island hold? A missing persons case has one question at its center. A death investigation has 100. And the very first of those questions, the most basic one of all, the one that medicine and science are supposed to be able to answer, would prove to be the hardest. How did Nolan Wells die? 2 autopsies would try to answer it. What they found, and what they could not find, is where this story goes next. There is a promise buried deep in the modern world, one we rarely say out loud but all quietly believe. The promise is this: when someone dies, science can tell us why. Put the body before trained eyes, run the tests, follow the protocols, and the truth will surface. Medicine will speak. the question will close. The story of Nolan Wells is what happens when that promise runs into its limits. Because in the weeks after that National Park Service ranger made his discovery off the northwestern shore of Horn Island, not one but two autopsies would be performed on this 18-year-old. Two teams of forensic professionals, two examinations in two different cities, hundreds of miles apart, and at the end of both, as of this recording, the most basic question in the entire case remains officially unanswered. How did Nolan Wells die? Let us walk through it carefully, in order, because the details matter. When Nolan's body was recovered on July 6th, it came under the authority of the Jackson County coroner, a man named Bruce Lind, and the coroner made an early observation that would shape everything after it. By his account, there were no immediate obvious signs of foul play or trauma on the body. Hold that phrase in mind. No immediate obvious signs. It is not a conclusion, it is a first look. And the coroner himself treated it as exactly that, because rather than closing the matter there, he did the opposite, citing the uncertain circumstances of the death. A healthy young athlete, an island, an empty seat on a boat. His office requested a full autopsy from the state's highest forensic authority, so that trained specialists could determine whether there was anything the first look could not see. And so, on July 7th, 2026, one day after the recovery, 3 days after the boat came back without him, the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office performed the official autopsy on Nolan Xavier Wells. That examination happened behind closed doors, as these examinations always do. What the state's pathologists found on their table that day, what they measured and documented and concluded, was not released to the public. That is standard. An autopsy report in an open death investigation is an investigative document, not a press release. But one piece of the process was publicly acknowledged, and it explains much of the waiting that followed, the toxicology. Toxicology is the part of a death investigation that answers what was in the body, and it cannot be rushed. Samples go to a laboratory. The testing takes weeks, sometimes longer. It is standard in every death investigation of this kind, and until it comes back, even a completed physical examination is a report with a hole in its center. So through the middle of July, the official position out of Mississippi was, in effect, a held breath. Autopsy performed, results pending, toxicology outstanding, and a family, and by now a country, waiting. But Nolan's family was not content to wait on a single examination they could not see. And this is where the story takes the turn that would put it on stages far from the Mississippi coast. The family, through their legal team, commissioned a second autopsy, an independent one, not to replace the state's work, but to stand beside it. A separate set of expert eyes, answering to the family rather than to any government office. They did not choose those eyes lightly. On July 10, 2026, 6 days after Nolan disappeared, 4 days after he was found, the independent autopsy was performed in Washington, D.C. by Dr. Roger A. Mitchell, Jr. Understand who that is. Dr. Mitchell is a board-certified forensic pathologist, a physician whose entire specialty is determining how human beings die. And he serves as the president of the National Medical Association, the oldest and largest organization of black physicians in the United States. When a family reaches for a second opinion and comes back with a figure of that standing, it tells you two things at once: how seriously they took the question and how little they were willing to leave to trust. So now there were two examinations, the state's on July 7th in Mississippi, the family's on July 10th in Washington. Surely between them an answer. Here is what the independent autopsy concluded. Cause of death, undetermined, pending investigation. Manner of death, undetermined, pending investigation. Undetermined, after a full forensic examination by one of the most credentialed pathologists in the country. Undetermined, not drowning, not accident, not foul play, not natural causes. The report, in its formal language, declined to say. Now, an undetermined finding is not a failure of the pathologist. It is a finding with reasons behind it, and Dr. Mitchell, to his credit, put those reasons in writing. His report acknowledged its own limitations, plainly and specifically. And those limitations are where this chapter becomes something more than a medical footnote. First, the second autopsy was, by definition, the second. The state had examined Nolan first, and in the course of that first examination, some of his remains had been retained by the state. Let us be careful and fair here. Retaining certain remains during an official autopsy is a common, standard practice in forensic pathology. It is not by itself sinister. But it meant that when Dr. Mitchell began his examination in Washington, he was not working with everything. There were gaps on his table that no skill could fill, and one of those gaps was as specific as it was troubling to the family. The throat was not present at the time of the second autopsy. In a case where an 18-year-old was found in the water, where the questions include how he came to be in that water and what his final moments held, the throat is not an incidental structure. It is one of the regions a pathologist examines with particular care, and it was not there for Dr. Mitchell to examine. As of this recording, the doctor is actively working to obtain it, so that the examination he performed can be completed. Second, when Dr. Mitchell performed his autopsy, the toxicology results did not yet exist. He was examining the body without knowing what the laboratory would eventually say had been within it. And third, time itself had done its work. Days had passed between the recovery of the body and the second examination, and the natural processes that follow death can obscure precisely the kinds of findings a pathologist needs most, complicating both the physical examination and the toxicology to come. This is not speculation. It is written into the report's own acknowledgments. So Dr. Mitchell, in his formal report, laid out the questions his examination could not close. How did Nolan enter the water? Were there injuries that could no longer be detected? What would the laboratory work reveal? The report answered honestly, it did not yet know. Undetermined, pending investigation, with the emphasis, perhaps, on pending. Because even the family's own attorney, standing on that stage in Chicago, framed the finding not as an ending but as a piece. Another part of the puzzle, he called it, one that told them significant things while leaving them, in his words, with more questions than answers. Step back and look at what this chapter actually is. A county coroner who saw no immediate obvious signs of trauma and ordered a full autopsy anyway. A state examination whose findings sat sealed while toxicology ground forward. An independent examination by a nationally renowned pathologist that returned the one word no grieving family wants to hear. Undetermined, 2 autopsies, 2 cities, 2 teams of experts, and between them, no publicly established answer to the simplest question a death can pose. That is not where cases like this usually stand 3 weeks in, and it is exactly why this one refused to fade from the headlines. Before we go on, this is where I want to hear from you. 2 forensic examinations, and still no determined cause. What do you think the autopsies may be missing? What questions would you want answered next? Subscribe to the channel and put it in the comments below, because in the next chapter, we get into the details that people are actually arguing about, the specific findings, the documents, and the contested facts at the center of this case. Because while the autopsies could not settle how Nolan died, they surfaced details that would set off a firestorm. That is where we go next. Every case like this one eventually arrives at the same place. The timeline has been walked. The official process has been described. And what remains is a small set of specific details, fragments of evidence, phrases from documents, findings from reports, that everyone can see and no one can agree on. The details people argue about at kitchen tables and in comment sections. The details that will not resolve. This chapter is about those details. And before we touch a single one of them, let us set the rule we will follow, because in an active investigation this rule is everything. We will say where each detail comes from, we will say what it is claimed to show, and we will say, honestly, what remains unresolved about it. Confirmed facts and open questions are not the same thing, and we will not blur them. There are 3. The first came from the stage in Chicago. On July 22nd, at that news conference at the NACAP National Convention at McCormick Place, Attorney Ben Crump did not only announce that the independent autopsy had returned an undetermined finding, he shared something specific from Dr. Mitchell's examination, a physical observation. According to Crump, the independent autopsy found red discoloration on the back of Nolan's head, and alongside that observation, Crump relayed something else from the pathologist's report, a sentence that traveled around the country within hours. According to the family's attorney, the doctor who performed the autopsy stated that he could not rule out foul play. Now stop. Because this is exactly the kind of moment where a story like this one can slip its rails, and we are not going to let it. Could not rule out foul play is a precise forensic phrase, and it means precisely what it says, no more. It does not mean foul play occurred. It does not mean foul play is suspected. It means the examination, with its acknowledged limitations, could not eliminate the possibility. A pathologist working without toxicology, without certain retained remains, and against the effects of time, is a pathologist who cannot close doors, in either direction. The honest reading of that phrase is not an accusation. It is an admission of what remains unknown, and the discoloration itself sits in the same unresolved space. A finding of discoloration on the back of the head is an observation, not a conclusion. What caused it, when it occurred, and what it signifies. Those are questions for pathologists with complete information, and as of this recording, no pathologist with complete information has publicly answered them. Even commentators who have scrutinized this case closely have paired that detail with the same caution. There are many accidental possibilities. So here is where that first detail honestly stands. Attributed source, the family's attorney, relaying the independent pathologist's report, publicly, on a national stage. Claimed finding red discoloration and a cause of death that could not exclude foul play. Status, real, on the record, and unresolved. The second detail came not from a stage but from an inbox. As the investigation drew national attention, reporters obtained a document from inside the search itself, an email from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. You will remember this document from earlier in our story. It was part of the Marine Patrol's effort on July 5th. The description of Nolan circulated while searchers scanned Horn Island. A routine administrative message, listing the basic information a searcher would need. But when that email became public weeks later, one line in it drew all the attention. According to the document, witnesses had told investigators that Nolan's alcohol intake that day had been heavy. Let us handle this detail exactly as carefully as the first one, because it deserves the same discipline, and because a young man's memory is attached to it. What is that line, actually? It is a second-hand account, recorded in a search email, of what witnesses said. It is not a laboratory result, it is not a toxicology finding, it is not a medical determination of any kind. The toxicology testing that would actually establish what was or was not in Nolan's system was, at the time that email surfaced, still pending, and its results had not been made public. Which means the single line in that email is, as of this recording, an unverified witness account moving through official paperwork. And notice something about how that detail functions in this case, because it cuts in two directions at once. To some, it suggests a tragic but ordinary explanation. A holiday, an island, a young man in the water. To others, it raises its own questions, about who the witnesses were, about what they saw and when, about why this particular detail reached paper, while so much else about that afternoon remains unaccounted for. The document itself answers none of that. It is one reported sentence from unnamed witnesses, awaiting the laboratory work that could confirm it, complicate it, or contradict it. Attributed source, a Department of Marine Resources email from the search, obtained by national reporters. Claimed content, witnesses describing heavy alcohol intake. Status, on the record, and unverified by any release test. And then there is the third detail, the quietest one, the one that came not from an attorney or an agency, but from a mother and a father. When Nolan was found, he did not have his phone. And he did not have his keys. His parents have raised this publicly, repeatedly, and with a plainness that is its own kind of argument. Their question is the question any parent would ask, and it needs no dramatizing to land. Why? Think about what a phone is to an 18-year-old in the year 2026. It is not an accessory, it is the constant companion. The camera, the map, the lifeline, the thing that is in the hand or the pocket through every hour of a day like the 4th of July. A day, remember, that his friends documented in photographs. And Horn Island, of all places, an island with no facilities and no communication, is precisely the setting where a phone is the only thread back to the world. Now set the missing phone beside the account we examined in Chapter 2, the account, from one friend, that Nolan chose to stay behind on that island. If a young man decides to linger on a remote island as the boats head home, he is deciding to stay somewhere he can only be reached one way. The parent's question, in essence, is this: does a young man make that choice without his phone, without his keys? Or does the absence of those two ordinary objects hint that the parting was not as orderly as described? Here is the honest status of that detail, that the phone and keys were not with him, that is confirmed. It is the basis of the family's own public questions, and Nolan's phone would later figure in the investigation itself, in ways we will come to. But what the absence means, whether the items were left on a boat, lost to the water, or something else entirely, no official account has publicly established. It is a confirmed absence with an unconfirmed explanation, a detail that fits several stories and settles none of them. So there they are, 3 details. A discoloration and a phrase, could not rule out foul play, relayed by the family's attorney from an independent pathologist's limited examination. A single line about alcohol, secondhand, in a search email, unverified by any released toxicology. And a phone and a set of keys that were simply not there, raising a question 2 parents keep asking into the silence. Notice what those 3 details have in common. Not one of them is a conclusion. Each is a genuine fragment of the record, real, sourced on the record, and each one is incomplete. Each can be read innocently, and each can be read darkly, and the evidence made public so far does not force either reading. That is the actual uncomfortable state of this case. Anyone who tells you these details prove an accident is ahead of the evidence. Anyone who tells you they prove a crime is ahead of the evidence too. But here is what those fragments did do. Landing one after another, in the middle of a national spotlight, they transformed this case from a coastal tragedy into something much larger. A story about trust, about race, about institutions, and about who gets believed when the record is incomplete. The details themselves may be unresolved. The reaction to them was anything but, because by late July this was no longer only Mississippi's case. It belonged to the whole country, its courtrooms, its conventions, and in one disturbing turn, its criminal dockets. That is where we go next. By the middle of July, something had happened to this case that happens to only a handful of cases in any given year. It stopped belonging to one county on the Mississippi coast. The death of one 18-year-old on one barrier island had become a story that national networks led with, that podcasts dissected nightly, that millions of people who had never heard of Ocean Springs were now following like a serial. ABC, CNN, The New York Times, The Associated Press. Law and crime, national television programs and independent journalists alike, all watching one small city grieve. The question is why? Why this case? And the honest answer has several layers. This chapter is about those layers. The meeting rooms, the fault line running underneath the story, and the moment the noise around the case crossed into crime itself. Start in a conference room in Jackson County. On July 15, 2026, 11 days after the boat came back with an empty seat, Nolan's parents, Christine Wells Wansley and Elmore Wansley, walked into a meeting with the person who will ultimately carry this case wherever it goes, the Jackson County District Attorney, Angel Myers McElrath. Beside them were their attorneys, Ben Crump, by now the public face of the family's fight for answers, and Eric Hertz, the lawyer leading the legal team's own independent investigation. Understand the weight of that room. On one side of the table, a grieving mother and father who had publicly questioned whether they were being told everything. On the other, the elected prosecutor whose office would decide how the machinery of justice handles their son's death. Meetings like that one can go badly. This one, by the accounts of those who were in it, did not. The family's side would later describe it as a respectful meeting. The district attorney walked them through the legal process ahead, the road this case would travel once the sheriff's investigation was complete, a road we will map fully before this story ends. And out of that meeting came something concrete, an agreement, and an unusual one, Nolan's phone. That phone, the one he did not have with him when he was found, the one his parents kept asking about, was in the possession of the family's legal team. And rather than one side simply handing it over, or one side refusing the other access, the two sides agreed to something rarer, a mutual inspection. Experts chosen by the family and investigators from the sheriff's office examining the contents of that phone together, each side's eyes on the same evidence at the same time. And by the account of the family's legal team, they expected a third party in the room for that examination, the FBI. Pause on what that arrangement tells you. A mutual inspection is what parties agree to when trust is thin and stakes are high, when neither side is willing to take the other's word for what the evidence shows. And the expected presence of federal agents tells you the investigation had grown past a county matter in more than just headlines. Whatever is on that phone, the messages, the photographs, the last recorded moments of a documented holiday, both sides wanted it seen with every safeguard in place. But meeting rooms and phone inspections do not, by themselves, put a case on every front page in America. To understand why the nation was watching, you have to look at the fault line running beneath this story from its first day. Return to the photographs from the boat, the ones we described at the start of this journey. A tall, smiling 18-year-old at the center of the frame, his arm around his friends. And in those images, Nolan appears to be the only black young man in the group. Nolan was an Ocean Springs native, a son of the Mississippi coast, raised there, known there. He went to that island with the friends he grew up with, a group that was mostly white. And when he alone did not come home, and when the days that followed produced an undetermined autopsy, an unverified email, and a family openly asking why, those photographs became, in the words of one national outlet, something like a Rorschach test for American race relations in the year 2026. Millions of people looked at the same images and saw different stories. Some saw a tragic accident and a grieving town. Others saw an echo of history, of Mississippi's history in particular, and a young black man whose death they feared would not be examined as hard as it deserved. The grief was real on every side of that divide. So was the suspicion. And it is precisely here that this story demands its greatest discipline, from the people covering it, and from all of us watching. Because the honest state of the evidence is the one we laid out in the last chapter. Fragments, real and sourced, that do not yet force any conclusion. Nothing publicly established has proven that race played any role in what happened on Horn Island. And nothing publicly established has answered every question the family has raised. Both of those sentences are true at once. Holding them together is the entire challenge of this case. The man tasked with investigating it said as much himself. Sheriff John Ledbetter of Jackson County, facing a storm of national attention, made a public appeal that went beyond the usual call for tips. He asked the public not to spread unverified information about the case. Because by then, speculation and commentary were being shared far and wide, theories built on rumor, accusations aimed at people who had been accused of nothing, a flood of noise filling every gap the official silence left open. One report described it plainly. False claims and speculation were filling an information void. The sheriff insisted the public could have confidence in the investigation, that every genuine tip mattered, that even a small detail might contribute more than the person offering it could know. But his warning named the real danger of a case like this one, that the story people tell each other can outrun the facts, and that real human beings live at the sharp end of that story. And in the final days of July, that danger stopped being theoretical. One of the young people on that 4th of July trip, one of Nolan's friends, is the child of a sitting judge, Chancery Court Judge Ashley Cole. As speculation about the island boiled online, some of it turned toward the families of the friends, and it went further than words of suspicion. According to court documents, a man named Joseph Dumars of California was arrested for making a threat on social media against Judge Cole. A criminal arrest, not for anything that happened on Horn Island, but for what the frenzy around Horn Island produced. Authorities, including the state's attorney general, made clear they were cracking down on threats connected to the case. Think about what that moment represents. An investigation into one young man's death had now generated a second criminal case of its own, a measure of how hot the atmosphere around this story had become, and a warning about what happens when a nation's argument lands on a small town's doorstep. Yet through all of that noise, the family's own effort kept moving, methodically and in an unexpected direction. In the last days of July, Ben Crump stood before another national audience, this time at the National Urban League's annual conference in Nashville, Tennessee, and updated the country on the independent investigation that attorney Eric Hertz was leading. And he revealed that the team had brought in a new kind of expert entirely, oceanic engineering experts. Their assignment strikes at one of the strangest facts in this whole case, that Nolan's body was found in essentially the same location where he was last seen, 2 days in the Gulf of Mexico, currents, tides, wind. And yet, there. The engineer's task is to determine how and why, whether the water around Horn Island can explain that or whether it cannot. A district attorney and a mutual phone inspection. A nation staring at photographs and seeing two different countries. A sheriff pleading for restraint. An arrest born of the frenzy. And a team of engineers studying the water itself. That is why the nation is watching. And while it watched, the official process reached its most consequential moment yet, quietly and behind sealed doors. That is where this story stands, and it is where we go last. Every story like this one eventually has to come home. Away from the conventions and the cameras, away from the documents and the experts, back to the place where it began, a small city on the Mississippi coast, and a family with one less seat at their table. On a Monday in late July, around the 20th, Ocean Springs said goodbye to Nolan Xavier Wells. The funeral was held at Centerpoint Church on Highway 57 in Ocean Springs. In the morning hours, from 9 to 11, the doors were open for visitation, for the long, quiet line of people who needed to stand for a moment with the family and say what can be said, which is never enough. Then the service began. His town had prepared for one of the largest public gatherings the city had seen in years. Family, friends, teammates and former teammates, coaches, neighbors, churches and volunteers had spent days helping the family make ready, because that is what a town like Ocean Springs does. The same town that had put its private boats on the water when he was missing now filled a church when the search was over. Even the local school board had paused its regular meeting to remember him. 16 days after a 4th of July boat trip, the community that knew Nolan's number on Friday nights gathered to lay him to rest, without knowing why they had to. And then, and this is the part I ask you to hold on to, the family did something that tells you everything about who they are and who he was. After the funeral, they held a celebration of life at the Jackson County Fairgrounds. Not a wake in the heavy sense, a celebration. Family, close friends, teammates, the people who had actually known him, gathered to remember the tall, smiling young man from the photographs. His mother, Christine Wells Wansley, explained it in words that need no polishing. He would not want us sitting around crying, she said. She thanked the community for carrying them, and she asked to keep the gathering for the people who loved him, so that at least one room in this whole national story would hold only Nolan, and not the case. But the case did not pause. Even as the family grieved, the official process was moving toward its most consequential moment yet, and it arrived quietly, in the final days of July. The state autopsy, the official examination performed by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office back on July 7th, was completed. Around July 31st, officials confirmed it. The report was finished. After weeks of waiting, after the toxicology, after all of it, the state's answer to the question at the center of this case now exists. It is written down, it has a conclusion, and the public cannot see it. Because the report has not been released, it is expected to remain sealed, held back from the public, held back even from the commentary machine that has churned around this case for a month, and it is sealed for a specific structural reason. When the Jackson County Sheriff's Office completes its investigation, the case, the full file, the autopsy included, will be presented by the District Attorney's Office to a grand jury. Understand what that means, because it is the hinge on which everything now turns. A grand jury is a panel of ordinary citizens, drawn from the community, who meet behind closed doors. They will see what the public has not seen: the autopsy conclusions, the witness accounts, the photographs and videos investigators gathered from that island. The contents, perhaps, of a phone examined by both sides with federal agents present, and with all of it before them, those citizens will answer the question this entire story has been circling since the morning of July 6th. Did what happened to Nolan Wells involve a crime? If they find that it did, the case transforms. If they find that it did not, the case closes with an official answer at last. Either way, a room full of strangers, not a coroner and not an attorney, will render the first formal judgment on what happened on Horn Island. Now, two things must be said plainly here, because honesty is the debt this story owes. The first, the District Attorney's Office has been clear that presenting this case to a grand jury does not mean there is any criminality. In Jackson County, it is standard procedure for most unnatural or suspicious deaths. The process itself is not an accusation. It is the machinery working as designed. And the second, the officials investigating this case have a stated working theory, and it has not changed. From early in the investigation, authorities have said they believe it is likely that Nolan's death was an accidental drowning, and that they do not suspect foul play. That is the official position, stated on the record, and you deserve to hear it exactly that plainly. Not buried, not whispered. The people running this investigation believe, based on what they have seen, that a young man most likely drowned, and yet, the family's questions remain, and they are not vague questions. They are specific, and every one of them is still open. Why did Nolan stay behind on that island, if he stayed by choice at all? Why was he found without his phone and without his keys? What explains the discoloration the independent pathologist documented, the finding behind that careful phrase, could not rule out foul play? What did witnesses actually see that afternoon, and what might exist in the original, unedited photographs and videos investigators asked for, particularly, in their own words, any depicting alleged altercations? What will the throat examination show, once Dr. Mitchell obtains what was missing from his table? And what did the sealed toxicology actually find? Confirmation of a second-hand line in a search email, or something that complicates it? And then there is the question the family hired engineers to answer. Nolan's body was found in essentially the same location where he was last seen. 2 full days in the Gulf of Mexico, a body of water with currents, with tides, with wind, and he was there, off the northwestern shore, where the story had left him. The oceanic engineering experts working with the family's legal team are studying whether the water around Horn Island can account for that. Perhaps it can. Barrier Island waters behave in complicated ways. Perhaps it cannot. Their answer, whenever it comes, will either quiet one of this case's strangest facts or sharpen it. So here, truthfully, is where the case of Nolan Xavier Wells stands as of this recording. An 18-year-old college athlete, beloved by a town, gone after a holiday on an island. An official theory of accidental drowning, stated without ambiguity. A family, with one of the most prominent legal teams in the country, refusing to close the book on questions no one has answered. A completed autopsy, sealed, and a grand jury ahead, holding the next word, though perhaps not the last one. Both of these things are true at once, and this story has asked you to hold competing truths before. The officials may be right, and the family's questions may still deserve answers. Those are not enemies. In the best version of what happens next, the process ahead honors both. This case is not over. The grand jury has not yet convened. The sealed report has not been read into any record. The engineers have not delivered their findings. Whatever happens next, whenever those doors open, we will cover it, fully and carefully, the way this story deserves. So if you want to follow the case of Nolan Wells through to its resolution, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because the moment there is an answer, we will bring it to you. And while you are there, tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what question about this case you most want answered. We read every one, but the last word of this chapter does not belong to me, and it does not belong to any court. Through all of it, the search she joined herself, the stages she stood on, the funeral she planned, Christine Wells Wansley has asked one thing of the country watching her family's grief. Aware that people moved by her son's story might take to the streets on his behalf, she asked that any marches, any demonstrations, stay peaceful. Because that, she said, is what Nolan would have wanted. A mother asking for peace in her son's name. That is where this story rests, for now.